A very warm welcome to this hybrid session. So as it was shown on the title, monitoring care delivery, driving innovation, empowering patients, and even more important, the subtitle, which is the key of our discussion today, how can we leverage the full potential of data in healthcare? Welcome to everyone who made it to the room in this hybrid format. Also an as warm welcome to everyone dialed in on Zoom virtually. And it's my privilege to chair and host this discussion and this panel today. My name is Bernd Ohnesorge. I'm with Siemens Healthineers. They are looking after Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So a quite diverse market environment of developed markets as well as developing and underserved health systems. So we see the breadth of it already, and that will be also part of our discussion today. So data, one can call it the fuel of the future of medicine, and a fuel which is at least CO2 friendly. It doesn't work without any CO2 because you still need to generate a bit of energy to host it and distribute it, but it's still probably the biggest asset of driving innovative healthcare system and developing healthcare systems in the future. I'm very honored to host this panel today of very distinguished speakers from very different angles of health systems. So I'm really excited that we see this diversity and breadth today. And I'm as honored to have Cecilia Bonefeld-Dahl with us online, who will moderate us through the session. She is the head of the director of Digital Europe, the association, and in close contact with industry as well as all healthcare stakeholders. So with this, Cecilia, great to host us. Thank you very much. And over to you for the next steps.
Thank you so much, Bernd. I am as honest as you. I mean, I think one of the most exciting things was the realization of the healthcare sector that data plays a major role in the future of healthcare, and the ability to actually develop new services and really make a much better healthcare system, a much better prevention of diseases. And therefore, I'm very delighted to be here today and to play a role in this ecosystem of great stakeholders. So let me just, before we start the session, welcome our distinguished speakers. We have Professor Krömer from he's from the charity Universität Medizinisch Berlin, the CEO from Germany. And he has previously been the chairman of the managing board of Göttingen University Medical Center and dean of faculty of medicine for the George August University, also in Göttingen. He has a background in pharmacology and with a research focus on drug metabolism. Welcome so much, Professor. And then, not least, we have Dr. John Nikandenson. I hope that I pronounce it right. And John, if I may call you John from now, Dr. John from now on, I would be honored because I might not get it totally right. You are the director of African Center for Disease and Control and Prevention. You have currently served as the director, and you have a specialized technical institute of the African Union. And in early 2020, you were appointed as one of the WTO Director General with a special envoy on COVID-19 preparedness and response. You served also as the acting Deputy Principal Director of the Center of Global Health and Chief of International Laboratory Branch for the Division of Global HIV and TB. Welcome. With us, of course, we also have Bernd, and Bernd, it might not take any presentation, but let me just say that you have been one of the industry's main sources in understanding how data can play a major role in research development and development of services. You joined Siemens after completing your master's degree in data communication and digital signal processing in the University of Erlangen. And you hold a PhD thesis on methods of cardiac CT imagining from the Institute of Clinical Radiology of the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Not least, we have from Finland, one of the leading nations in really developing a healthcare system that builds on data and really uses digital as a main factor. She is the director of FinData, the new social and health data permit authority of Finland, and has a strong professional background with a PhD focused in biometrics from University of Helsinki. Welcome. Last but not least, we have Dr. Swaminathan from the World Health Organization, the chief scientist. And you're globally recognized as a researcher of tuberculosis and HIV, and you bring 30 years of experience for clinical care and research and have worked throughout your career to translate research into meaningful programs. So not only on the side of research, but really also implementing on ground the right program to prevent diseases and pandemics. Thank you so much for coming here. I must say, it's a very diverse panel, as Bernd said, and a very impressive list of speakers. So what will we do today? Well, we know that 30% of global stored data is generated by the health sector, but how much of it is actually used? How can we really leverage the use of data into our services? And how can we prevent future pandemics? It will take a lot of efforts. It will take cross-functional collaboration between technologists and between pharma companies and health data authorities. Today, we will focus on 4 key questions. How can we unlock the population of health data to prepare and avoid future pandemics? How can we better use collaboration between countries and health actors to provide better healthcare? How to ensure trust of patients? We know that 86% of Europe's citizens say that they are okay that we use their data for health services, as long as the data is secure and kept private. And what is the role of policymakers in building these healthcare systems of the future? How can we collaborate better towards a common goal? So let me maybe go to you, Bernd, and as the host of this panel, ask you, you have exactly this background, knowing about data and health system. And I remember a meeting with you in Brussels where you told me also the state of Europe in this and how we are lacking data basically to get to the next level. What is the role of data?
Thank you, Cecilia, also for reminding me of my past and how data science looked about 30 years ago when I studied it. It has evolved quite a bit, I might say, but some of the principles still remain the same. I mean, from a technological and innovation standpoint, I mean, let me just probably highlight a couple of aspects. To start with, what does digital data mean? How does it manifest in the use in health systems, and also what is the benefit of it? And we tend to look at it in, I would say, 3 pillars. There might be more, but 3 we believe are most interesting to also differentiate when you look about when you discuss digitalization. First is the possibility in broad databases, in electronic health records, that patient data is always readily available at the fingertip of a physician, to avoid double examination, to avoid contradictory information, to avoid readmission in health systems over and over and over again. We all know that this is still daily reality in many parts of Europe and in the world. So this is one aspect. How do you bring that data together and make it accessible wherever it's needed? Secondly, the telehealth delivery. So, I mean, we all learned in the pandemic that tele-delivery of information and virtual delivery information is important, and so is virtual delivery of healthcare. And this is why also regulations of how healthcare data is administered and where can it be available digitally and virtually is a challenge to be solved. And thirdly, and this is where innovation and medical and pharmaceutical industry comes in, is how do you build innovation and tools for data-driven medicine that you give into physicians' hands in order to make better clinical diagnosis and more personalized treatment decisions. And while there's a lot of discussion of data security, rightfully so, data governance, I mean, one should never forget what is really the benefit that the patient and healthcare systems have from it. And first, the obvious one, if you can combine through algorithms, the decisions made by thousands or even probably millions of physicians, millions of decisions made by human physicians with outcome behind it that is then compiled to algorithms known as artificial intelligence. We tend to advocate that artificial intelligence is not something that is some robot having made up something. It is the combination and it is the pooling of millions of good and annotated decisions of human physicians that is then readily available at a point of decision making of one physician who wants to have another opinion. Physicians that way can make more precise diagnosis and better individualized treatment decisions, and we believe efficiency can be gained, but not by making physicians redundant, but by giving them more time for what is most important for the dialogue and interaction with the patients. And thirdly, we all know how diverse the world is. I mean, we have mature healthcare systems where to give physicians more time to spend with their patients is a key benefit. In underserved or developing health systems, that problem doesn't even exist, quote unquote. So that's why to help with artificial intelligence and data-driven tools to help solve, at least have a contribution to solving the inequalities of health provision across different health systems, to bring know-how to the point of care by the developed world or mature systems into where more of that know-how is needed at the point of diagnosis and at the point of treatment decision. This is where we believe technology can definitely help. So what is the role, and here I am as a representative of industry, what is the role of technology and industry in this? And I might add, and I might mention, artificial intelligence and data-driven algorithms are already existing as we speak. Technology has gotten more intelligent to help with its use in a more automated way, in a less manual way, to ensure quality assurance and equality of quality delivered at the same point in time. It helps already today with decision-making, be it on imaging, diagnosis, where huge amounts of data are being generated and having to be processed, where physicians, radiologists cannot look through millions of slices anymore, but need assistance by algorithms to assist in the reading, and also take it further to even with all kinds of data to be compiled from biomarkers, from specific individual data points, that you can build even what we call digital twins of organs. We're not saying digital twins of people or patients, but digital twins of organs that we understand in their properties, so that treatment decisions, personalized treatment decisions, can be made. And while we all have seen and we still are seeing it, that disruptive events like the COVID-19 pandemic call for action of having very quickly availability of data, of pooling know-how to very quickly innovate tools. And we saw it in the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all have wished it could have been even faster, of developing tests, of developing vaccines, of developing imaging algorithms, in developing algorithms to best serve critically ill patients with individualized therapy. That was a clear reflection and call for action, that data is needed and pooling for data is needed to act very quickly. And while we are all still impressed by what we experienced in COVID-19, let us not forget that there is quote unquote omnipresent pandemics, which is cancer, which is cardiovascular disease. I know cancer is not a pandemic, not an infectious disease. Partly that sometimes it has its origin there, but these are the most critical illnesses that are calling for strong needs of digital and data pooling so that algorithms can help master them. What it needs It needs clear partnership of governments, healthcare providers, academia, non-universal research, but with industry, because it's in the end industry that develops products, licenses it through the regulatory bodies, and can give it to physicians' hands to make it readily available for patients. It needs well-governed databases, and I'm privileged to say that we have the representative of FinData today, because it's one example of how that can work. We see it in other examples in Israel of the Clalit health system. So it can be done if everyone is pulling on the same string, so that data can be made available to drive innovation for the benefit of the patient. So with this, I hand it back to you, Cecilia. I'm advocating for a strong partnership and collaboration. In my role as overseeing Europe and the Middle East and Africa, I'm obviously also advocating for finding a strong base here in Europe to drive this innovation. As my final comment to it, because artificial intelligence and data-driven tools are not fully healthcare system agnostic. They need the context of local health systems to really take effect. There's a limitation of how you can use data from Asia or from the US to train algorithms to make it applicable in Europe. It works to some extent, but it doesn't work to full extent. So that's why these innovations there's some overarching principles to it, but there's as much need for local embedding in respective health systems, so that innovation has to be generated out of there. So thank you for giving me the opportunity of this opening statement. And Cecilia, back to you to invite the next speaker.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to Dr. Nikengason. You have really been involved directly in prevention and action under, for example, COVID and other pandemics. What do you see are the biggest roadblock for using data, and how can we leverage those data in a much better way in the future?
Thank you. Let me first of all appreciate excuse me, the organizers for including me as part of this very exciting conversation. And I must agree with the first speaker when he talked about data fuel. I'll take it one step further and actually talked about data as the oxygen of good public health practice. I'll focus uniquely on public health practice, since the previous speaker focused on the clinical component of that. And in doing this, there are three things that come to mind from where I sit: the issues of capacity, the issues of impact, and then the issues of sustainability of the data system. So let's look at data architecture as a whole and look at the different, what I call the touch points, the critical touch points for data science and data architecture. From where I sit, you're looking at what it takes to acquire quality data, what it takes to warehouse that quality data, what it takes to share that data, and what it takes to use the data in a timely fashion. So I think those are the four cornerstones of an impactful data system. If you look at all of these in the 21st century, we absolutely have to agree that there's need to count everyone. Remember, I'm in the lane of public health. It's very critical to count everyone and make everyone count. But we should also be counting what needs to be counted, right? So as the previous speaker indicated, in the context of the data architecture elements and pillars that I listed. So when you look at that, there are certain things that come to mind, and which we must address early on as we move forward with in the 21st century for data use. One is, whose data is it that we are collecting? And second is the data ownership. The data ownership, either you're dealing with that at the patient level or at the community level or the government level. Then responsibility. So in other words, what do you do with that data when you collect the data? What is your own responsibility as public health experts, and what is the responsibility of the patient? Then data security. I'm happy the previous speaker touched on that. All of these factors need to be considered when we are looking at the effective impact of data, because there's no point warehousing data, collecting data acquisition and sharing that if they will not be used or there is no impact there. So it's extremely important. So when I say this, I think the underpinning of data from the part of the world we see is trust. If we address all those elements, the elements of ownership, the elements of security, that we are building trust. That is the only way that public health will benefit from data sharing. Good public health practice is community engagement and building trust with the community to obtain that data. We have to look at data intelligence and big data in the context of where you sit. From the context in the more advanced countries, it is a given. I mean, it is understood that data, big data is important, that artificial intelligence can be used. But in some parts of the world, or most part of the world, it is still very basic concepts that feed into the data architecture that I indicated that we are struggling with to put in place there. So where do we go from there? I think I would argue that to address those core elements of data systems, we need to look at systems and institutions that should manage that data. Without data, of course, we've all agreed it's like oxygen in the room. When the oxygen is present, you don't feel it. And if it's absent, you feel it acutely. So now we've seen it during the COVID crisis and other crises there. So going forward, there are two things that I think I put forward. One is how do we strengthen our national public health institutes so that they become the warehousing of that data. They become the institutions that acquire good data, warehouse it, share that data in a timely fashion, and then make sure that it is actually used. There must be an engine that drives that, otherwise we will be challenged going forward. I think that is one. Second and lastly is what I call leapfrogging of data and innovation. And innovation and leapfrogging of data systems cannot occur without a strong partnership with the private sector, strong partnership with the government institutions, and of course, a respectful partnership with partners that work in areas that we or conduct public health or carry out public health practice. So I think those are the two things that I'll leave with you, but I look forward to a lively debate on what do we do with data and who owns the data and issues of data security and trust. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I ask you a follow-up question? So now we have gone through the pandemic with COVID, and one of the things I think we learned, at least in Europe, was that in Europe we didn't have a common data standard. So there was no standard for health data, which made it very hard to have interoperable data across even European countries. And then imagine if you go to the global level, we will have even more trouble. Do you think that we will be like putting efforts into the next, to having a common global data health standard that makes sure that we can have interoperable data?
I think that's an excellent question, Cecilia. So I think let's break down and deconstruct data, the globality of data into smaller pieces, where in order to get to that piece where we are dreaming at what I call the sky blue, we need to start at national level and build that trust and capacity for national levels to be able to acquire data, warehouse the data, share it in a timely fashion and use. If we do that, it fits into a regional mechanism. So imagine, say, in Africa, all 55 member states have systems that are collecting this accurate data and feeding it into a regional body, like the Africa CDC. Then the regional body feeds it into the global level. So we have to make it that it's also cultural sensitive. So just hoping that we'll have a central global base where all countries feed data into it in an interoperable manner, I think will be dreaming, aspiring very, very high. There's all issues that are listed, needless to repeat, issues of trust, ownership, and geopolitics, I mean, of the world. I mean, that is, we live in the world that it is, not the world that we wish it was. I mean, we have to factor in geopolitics then. With the big powers be ready to provide data at the same level as developing countries into a central repository in wherever it is there. I think that is a question that it needs to be discussed very openly.
Yeah. No, so you see much more like a national and then a roll-up. So the data is interoperable, but not necessarily kept in one big place. What did you find during the COVID pandemic? What did you find was the biggest roadblock looking at the use of data?
So the biggest roadblock we found during this pandemic was that it was countries didn't feel obliged to share data. And when they shared data, it wasn't comprehensive data. And it was processed data. I mean, not data that you could take it yourself, analyze it, and look at the trends, but rather they wanted to process. So that the unspoken language there was that I will do it for you, but I will not give you my data completely. I think that was a big challenge, and that is just inherent in the systems and cultures that we are dealing with. And again, it builds into the trust factor. What is it that is holding back countries to share data? Now, very importantly is what, as we discuss this global governance, pandemic governance, and treaties, we have to factor in this, that otherwise we build an architecture that doesn't work. Okay, we have to say, okay, bring it, the concept of sharing data, acquiring it, bring it as closer to the communities as possible so that people feel trust, they build trust into it. If you build trust into a national level data system, then you support a regional base, and then the regional base fits into the global architecture. But they're shooting at very high, I mean, putting data in a place that we just don't know how that data will be used, the security of that data, and how we are, your own responsibility in the data becomes very, very complex there. So what did we observe? It was that data sharing was just based on trust and the goodwill of countries, not because they were obliged to share the data. So I think that's why the continent is yearning for a system that will actually oblige countries respectfully to say, look, sharing data is for a common good. We need to share, but there need to be mechanisms that make sure that like country X doesn't feel like they have to share just because they like to share it with John, but that it is obligatory and it's for mutual interest. It's not a zero-sum game that if you share data, you lose. So I think that those are some of the observations that we noticed during the pandemic.
So kind of a global convention on how to share data could be a vision of the future.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me jump to the next speaker, which is Joanna Seppänen. I mean, we know that Finland is one of the places, the Nordics is one of the places that is really walking in front with data, and has also looked at, you know, how do we hold ownership of data? How do we make sure that people trust? Of course, the Nordic societies are very, how do you say, as communities with high trust also in governments, which makes it easier. So we are eager to hear, and I know that you also have a presentation. We're eager to hear your version of how do we do this and how do we make it work?
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be in this and to have the opportunity to discuss with you about this very interesting and actual theme. I had some slides, so perhaps it's possible to see them. My purpose is, I thought that I would use my keynote to do in this describing how the health data governance, how the secondary use is organized and arranged here in Finland. Next slide, please. When we talk about the health data and very sensitive health information of people, legislation and legal basis is a very central thing. So you might know that in Finland, an Act on Secondary Use of Health and Social Data took effect in May 2019, which streamlines and gives rules for the secondary use of social and health data in scientific research, statistics, development and innovation activities, teaching, also in knowledge-based management and some authorities' duties. So, moreover, presenting FinData, the new act gives FinData the authority to grant permissions to practically all the health and social data that is collected in Finland in everyday healthcare when people go to doctors and hospitals and so on. we talking about the ownership. In Finland, we have we call it an opt-out system. So in principle, all the data that is collected in healthcare can be used also for secondary purposes unless you opt out. So the citizens are in unless they say, no, I don't want my health data to be used for research. I want to opt out. We have facilitated that in Finland and in FinData, and we started about 1.5 years ago, and until now, only little bit more than 200 people out of 5.6 million population have opted out. So in practice, so far, all the Finns are in, and the health data can be used for secondary purposes. Next slide, please. Here is just a big picture of the data we have and that can be accessed through FinData. So as I mentioned, all the data that is collected in connection with the social care and healthcare operating units, both in public and private sector. So the patient records, both in primary and special healthcare, so in health centers and in hospitals, all the prescriptions. In Finland, we have since 2017, all the prescriptions, medicine prescriptions are in digital form, in electronic form. So they can be also utilized for research and knowledge-based management. And also the data from that accumulates from social services, so elderly care, care for handicapped, children care, and so on. Then we have quite rich national registers. Then some of them tend back to 1950s. For example, I use always as an example the Finnish Cancer Registry that has all the cancers diagnosed in Finnish people since 1953. So the time series are quite long, and the registers cover practically the whole population. Lots of research have taken place and have been done already, but still we've recognized that it could be done more. So the registers and the data is so rich that it's still very unused and could be used much more. So that's why we have facilitated a one-stop shop for the data. The biobank and genome data legislation are on their way. Can I have the next slide, please? Just shortly what FinData is doing. We are granting the permits always when the data is required from multiple controllers. So before a researcher would have to go to each controller separately and apply for the data. Now you apply just once from FinData, and we will then collect the data for you. Always when the data is from the private healthcare units and from the national electronic health records. After permitting the data, we will collect it, link it before we give it to you for use. You will be using it in a secure IT environment. So the data is kept in controlled environments. We have the duty to produce and maintain such an remote access system for our clients. Our help desk has been very popular. So now for the first time in Finland, we have one single contact point where you can ask about the availability, quality, price, accessibility of the health and social data that exists in Finland, and we are doing our best to answer. And then we will go back to data controllers and ask for their advice if we don't know the answer. We have anonymization services, and also we are doing metadata description work. We are supporting the data controllers to describe the data and to put it in a structured form. So in the long run, the data to be interoperable on the whole Finland. Did I have some slides? Next slide, please. And that is the aim. So why is that? I think I already came to that a little bit. To enable effective and safe processing, we are enhancing the data protection and data security by bringing the secondary use of health data to secure environments. We are improving the quality by leading the metadata work, the work that aims to data structures and data descriptions. And of course, by doing the application permit work at one place, we are eliminating the overlapping administrative burden by that. Next slide, please. Trust is a must, so this can't be emphasized too much. The compliance of the new act is supervised by many entities and institutions. The safety is we are trying to do is as good as we can here in Finland. The data sets are always made available without individuals' direct identifiers. That's called pseudonymization. So the direct identifiers are never given out. The data can be handled only in safe environments, and the environments are inspected and controlled. So we are doing our best to keep the data safe and to remain and to earn the trust of the citizens to be able to use their health data. Thank you. That was my slide set, and I'm happy to take part in the discussion.
Thank you so much. I think we can say that Finland has been a big inspiration for what is happening also, for example, on European level at the moment with the Data Governance Act, where exactly that intermediate position or role in society is defined, having a trusted data broker where private sector researchers, developers, hospitals can come for more data to use it for the benefit of society. May I ask you, can you try to give maybe a few examples of how can a hospital use this? How can a researcher use this? How can a private sector company get the data, and what can they use it for?
Well, hospitals, for example, they can. There was a purpose called knowledge-based management. So hospitals can use the data for managing the queues, managing the overload of the personnel. They can also the data has been used for trying to smooth and rationalize the pathways of patient. For example, when a patient starts from the primary healthcare, then he or she is forwarded to the hospital for an operation, for example. After that, he or she needs rehabilitation and some other social services. So the patient has to visit many places, and if the information is following the patient, that's much more smoother for the patient and also saves resources from the personnel. So that's one I think quite good example, the patient pathways. Well, I don't make a big difference between private sector and public sector research. We have customers from both. Nowadays, the division is not so valid anymore because we have these big projects that have, for example, is led by a university. There are pharmaceutical industries taking part. There is third sector taking part. So big research projects are combos from all the sectors, mainly nowadays. But the data is, I think 85% of our data is given for research purposes. So that's the most popular one.
Do you think that this model could be like a mini pilot for how it can be done, not only in Europe and European countries, but also globally? Is it something that can be, do you think it's directly transferable to countries in Africa or somewhere else?
Well, no, I don't believe. I think that it's something that is very deeply connected with the Finnish society, with the Finnish legislation, also, of course, the European legislation. We have the GDPR ruling over. But I think each society and country has to find their own way of how to, for example, collect data, how to maintain it, how to link it. Many countries don't have. One of the key issues is that we have a personal ID for each Finn that serves as a key when we link the data from different registers. Many countries don't have that, and that has to be solved in order to be able to utilize the register data. So we are, or they are planning the European health data space, and a lot of ideas and inspiration has been taken from our Act and FinData, but still the national nodes and how the data collection and everything is organized in each country has to be solved quite locally, I think.
Thank you so much for this. I think it was a very great example of how to do it. And I think I picked up, many good things, EID being one of it, one component in making this work. From John's session before, that there needs to be some kind of an international agreement on how to do it, and that it's obligatory to basically share data in certain situations. And also that we're missing some kind of standard on how to actually do this. Let me turn to the next speaker, Professor Dr. Krömer. So you are one of you represent one of your universities that are really in need of this data and using data for advanced research. How do you see, how can we leverage this data, and how far are we basically from the goal of enhancing data to the maximum extent in healthcare?
I think if you look at this issue from my position, it's a bit different from what Bernd Ohnesorge said, but at the end, we have very similar conclusions. I think everybody has to be aware that there's currently a real revolution going on in medicine. I always tend to give a practical example. I have a watch at my wrist where I'm able to get an ECG within 30 seconds, which gives you a certified diagnosis whether or not you suffer from a very frequent arrhythmia. So I keep on telling my people that on my wrist there are 3 jobs which are currently at our hospitals, which is a physician, a nurse, and an admin person. And this is not the question doing it public or private. This is a private issue. And we have to keep in mind that there is a strong competition between the public issues, which we've just seen from Finland in a very convincing manner, and private enterprises doing in essence the same. And we have to keep in mind that data have no borders, conventional borders. And so we at Charité, which is among the largest academic medical centers in Europe, we're completely convinced that there is a revolution going on in medicine. And we therefore are convinced that we have to rethink medicine in a way along these data lines. That as a short introduction, I will finish by the idea that this revolution, as every revolution, has chances and risks, and we should weigh them and balance them in a very careful way. I think we all agree that the future of medicine is data-driven. We have seen that in the Corona era, I give you a practical example from my institution. We have served numerous hospitals and the ICUs of numerous hospitals by a system which is called Enhanced Recovery After Intensive Care, where our physicians would serve as advisors to various hospitals dealing with extremely sick COVID patients. So a large number of intensive care units at other hospitals were actively supported. So we are able in part, and as a German, I have to say in particular, compared to Finland, at a very minor and restricted part, so far, we're able to generate and process high quality structured data. And there are, of course, three issues to be dealt with. One is the local system, which you build up at your own institution, and we integrate the data at our place in a local health data platform. And in particular in Berlin, we intensely work on exchange platforms with large local other hospitals. There's a national engagement. We have an expansion of infrastructure with the current now outgoing government. And a key issue was strengthening the IT at the academic medical centers in our country. And of course, and it has been addressed by the previous speakers, there's a strong international component, which I think focuses a bit on the European issue, which I think, as we heard from one of the speakers, is not the right way to focus just on Europe. But we have a European University Hospital Alliance among major academic players in Europe where we try to solve these data. And of course, the key issue in that is interoperability, finding real international standards. And there we're, of course, on the way to leverage the advantages for clinicians, for researchers, but at first for patients to get these type of data. It's without saying that once you have these data, they are collected once. You don't have to do repeated procedures and these type of things. In Germany, you can clearly see that it's of utmost importance to get the support from the political framework, because in our country there's not a very advanced situation in terms of using medical data, and this has something to do with politics. The current now outgoing government has done quite a lot, investing billions of euros into the hospital sector, and also for the first time in a so-called telematics infrastructure, we will have a national electronic health records, which is patient-driven and patient-centered, and will be managed by patients themselves and function across the sectors. And this should go in various issues which we currently don't have. I always give this example. One of the most successful vaccines in the world was developed in our country, yet we have no digital follow-up of this, the use of this vaccine in our own country. In fact, Germany doesn't know exactly how many of its inhabitants are currently vaccinated due to a lack of a proper electronic record system. But it's a bit on the way we can learn from Finland and other countries, and the funding of digitization in healthcare is really under discussion with this new government. And I think the sustainable effort systems throughout Europe and way beyond Europe is really something above the national level, and we should really work on that. And I think at the end, it's not about digitization per se, but I see this digital issue as an opportunity to kind of democratize medicine for real better care. And coming back to my initial remark of risk versus chance, there's certainly a risk, and the issue I tend to tell in this part is if you look to the German car industry, which 6 years ago was one of the best in the world, now it was taken over by or overcome by a company which started the car from the digital part. And I think that this thing, like a Teslarization of medicine, can happen very well to us. On the other hand, there are, of course, major chances. You can have a complete new building of systems, of medical systems, which can be highly interesting, for example, to the global south. In our countries, medicine is based on hardware and has an addition of digital issues. We see now chances to start from the digital side and really rebuild new systems. So I think it's our task to carefully balance in our countries the risk versus the chance. I guess there's no doubt about that. We have to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You mentioned that the data has no borders, and normally we say digital has no border. And apparently it seems that these two, digital and health and data, is really coming together. So what would be the first steps towards, you mentioned interoperability, towards making sure that data can be used globally? Who would take that responsibility of basically, should it start from private sector? Should it be governments or researchers, or is it a collaboration? But how do we get on that path of common standards of data, health data?
I think, speaking as a German in that, it's for us, it's not thinkable that somebody else than the government, the political side of our country, takes the first steps to do that. And if you want to go to the European level, I think it's mandatory that the individual countries have really sorted out the systems, as we have seen really convincingly from the FinData issue. So that should be the steps. And we see a lot of structures now. If you take an example, the European cloud structure, Gaia-X or something like that, which go to the right direction. But there's lots of work to do. And in particular in our country, it's very important to convince our citizens that this is really worthwhile to do, that it's the future of health is not thinkable without digitalization.
Thank you so much. A strong message that governments in the end will have to be an important stakeholder in defining data interoperable standards, and that data has no borders, and it has a huge potential and might even start the development of new services from the private sector, from the digital companies, not necessarily only from research institutions or public institutions, but it must be a collaboration in the future. Thank you so much. Let me turn to Dr. Swaminathan. Doctor, you have been a major player in some of in shaping these efficient on-ground response to pandemics, trying to translate the data and the medicine into efficient on-ground actions. So what is missing? I mean, what's the next step? What has been kind of the things that you have thought, like, if I only had this data, or if I only had these systems? What are the elements that you see is really needed to develop now?
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and it's been a fascinating discussion, and maybe I can build on some of the points that previous speakers have made, and particularly learning from the COVID pandemic. Clearly, over the last 21 months or so, all of us are operating in a digital world much more than we used to. I mean, it has changed the way we do things on a day-to-day basis, but in a very positive way. And I think we should continue to do that. And maybe this conference is one of those early tests of a hybrid conference, and we'll have to see how it goes and whether everybody has a good experience. But it's also exposed a lot of the inequities that we see in the world today. And so I want to start with, the divide. We heard about FinData, an excellent example of a country, albeit a small one and economically very high income country. But they've been able to, I think, is a very good model for the way people's data should be and could be used for public good. I want to go back also to the fact that we still don't have basic data from many countries. And on the one hand, we're talking about using large data sets for artificial intelligence. But if you look at the data that WHO gets, 7 out of 10 deaths in the world today do not have a cause of death assigned to them. I mean, the civil registration vital statistics is something that everybody takes for granted. You expect all births and deaths to be registered. You expect that deaths would have a cause assigned to them, and yet in many countries, we do not have that. And that is a big barrier actually for policymakers, because you don't really understand the disease burden in your own country. Similarly, in the early days when diagnostics were very limited, and again, this relates also to the equitable availability and access to products during the pandemic. Even today, there's a 100 times discrepancy in the rate of diagnostic tests that are available in low-income country versus a high-income country. So we all talk about vaccine equity, but the same thing applies to other health tools and products. And so we found ourselves in many countries literally flying blind, because you don't really know what the status of the pandemic is. And just because they haven't reported that many cases, it really didn't reflect that they didn't have that many cases in the country, or that there weren't deaths occurring. And in fact, the seroprevalence surveys that have been done, in fact, show that on the African continent, the exposure to the virus is somewhere in the range of close to 50%. So it's about 48% average for that region, which if you go by the number of reported cases, Africa only accounts for less than 5% of reported cases globally. And that's because 85% of cases are not detected. So this really is a very practical example of the lack of data and how it can impact your response. How do policymakers actually respond if you don't have the data? Another example is the fact that we, of course, collected data in real time on COVID, and about 50% of the data submitted to us did not have even an age and a sex disaggregation. So even at that basic level, we did not have this from countries. So we really are talking about a world where the basics need to be set up. And I think this is where governments, public health agencies, private sector need to work together. The Lancet Financial Times Commission on Governing Health Futures, which is going to be released tomorrow, talks about digital connectivity as a fundamental human right. Because today, without digital connectivity, you do not have access to things that you need in your day-to-day life, including education for millions of children around the world who've not had any access to online education during the pandemic. The other thing we hear often when we talk about data sharing a lot and open data, but then the question to be asked is, yes, everybody must share data openly. It should be treated as a public good, and we're trying to promote the concept of data solidarity. But then the benefits that arise from that data should also flow back to citizens equitably. And I think that if you talk to people about sharing their data, most people would be willing to share their data, even their personal health data, if they were assured of a couple of things. One, that the data would be used responsibly and in a way to help people like themselves, not necessarily them personally, but if you're a patient with diabetes or you're a patient with Parkinson's, you want science to advance. You want things to happen that can actually help you and people like you. And secondly, they want to be assured that the data will not be used surreptitiously or in ways that is being sold without their knowledge or without their consent. So when we talk about sharing as a data being a public good, I think we also have to think about the benefits. And I remember a researcher who joined one of our conferences online when we were discussing genomic data sharing said, yes, researchers from Africa have been uploading data onto the global data platforms like GISAID and others, and in real time, so that we can track the evolution of the virus and the pandemic. But we don't see the vaccines flowing back to us. The vaccines that are made using that, the genomic sequence data, vaccines against variants will be developed, are being developed. But when it comes to the sharing of the benefits, unfortunately, the same principles, don't seem to apply. So I think that's one point that we really need to consider. Whose perspective is it? people have already raised the question, who owns the data? And if they're willing to share their data, what should they really get in return? We've come out with a framework for governance of artificial intelligence-based health technologies. This was released in the month of the end of June. And it really lays out the principles, and it lays out actually a very practical guidance to developers of AI-based technologies, to ministries of health, public health authorities on how to govern, and to the providers, that's doctors in hospitals, because there are many questions that arise really about the dynamics between a patient and a provider when you start using AI-based diagnostics or AI-based treatments. The other issue that was raised is the interoperability standards, I think very, very important. And again, the WHO is very much looking at this, because I think as a global health agency, it's our responsibility to develop these standards to make it easier for countries to share data and to have common platforms. So for the COVID certificate, I think it's one of the early examples of us sharing the technical standards for a digital COVID certificate, which will be interoperable across borders. Now, the question that did come up is around the trust framework. And how do you develop a trust framework to support a common digital COVID certificate? And again, that's something to be discussed, whether WHO takes responsibility for that, or that's it's a shared responsibility. We're working also because in 2019, when the science division was created, one of our areas of focus was digital health. So we do have a global strategy on digital health, which lays out over the next 10 years. I mean, the goal is really, how do we achieve the SDG targets? And we know that we're falling behind now, falling way behind because of the COVID pandemic. How can we harness digital tools, digital technologies and data to accelerate and fast track our getting to the SDGs? So it's really important that the private sector, I think, has an important role to play, firstly, in developing digital infrastructure, secondly, in being respectful of the governance and other frameworks that are being set up, including the ethics of using data. And thirdly, I think a responsibility also on what they do with people's data. And, the algorithms, we've seen that algorithms have also been used to harm, to drive more misinformation. And so there's a very dangerous side to that as well, which needs to be looked at. And I think, I'm sure more will be discussed at this conference on the infodemic and how we have to manage misinformation and disinformation going forward. So on the digital health strategy that we have, one of our areas of focus is public health technologies. That's digital technologies. More and more, I think, equipments, everything is going to be run on digital platforms. And so in the past, the WHO has had a program of pre-qualification of drugs and vaccines, now going back many, many years, where basically a certification and tells people that this drug or this vaccine is safe, it's effective, and it's made to quality standards, and that it's safe for countries to use those products and individuals. Now, something like this is needed for digital health technologies, because a lot of them are going to be coming into the market, and not all are equal in terms of their effectiveness. And in fact, not all gadgets, are really helping. You could even provide misleading data. So we want to come up with standards on how to assess and how to validate these tools. And I think a lot more research is needed into the effectiveness, the safety and the effectiveness of digital tools in achieving better health outcomes. In COVID, we've seen a number of examples of real-time data sharing. I think that's been one of the positives that's happened. I mentioned the genomic databases, where over 4 million whole genome sequences today are available, the virus, on a platform called GISAID. There are other platforms as well with millions of data points available. We have a COVID clinical data platform that we've encouraged countries to provide data to on detailed patient information. And this is how we've been able to develop definitions for things like, the multi-system inflammatory syndrome, and now long COVID. Recently, last week, we released the definition for an individual with long COVID. All of this is only possible when you can aggregate data from different sources and have a representative data platform. And the third thing we've done is more in the area of research, which is encourage researchers who were running clinical trials of drugs, for example, to report their results to us so that we can do prospective meta-analyses to inform treatment guidelines as rapidly as possible, rather than waiting for individuals to, publish their papers in peer-reviewed journals. Normally, it takes a very long time. We've been able to fast-track that. And also, we're now providing that guidance on digital platforms so that ultimately, we want all our WHO recommendations to be available to healthcare workers around the world on their phones or on their devices, and to be used for decision support when they're dealing with the patient. So again, it's a journey. We've started moving in that direction. But again, basically, we have to think about the basics first. We cannot put AI before data. We have to first focus to make sure that countries have the capacity to be able to generate, collect, store, manage, analyze, and use data. Finally, I'd make, from my own experience in India, I've noticed that data often flows one way, doesn't always flow the other way back. So the community health workers who collect a lot of the data and feed it into the system often don't get the feedback from the data that they've generated. And so it doesn't really get used in their work to improve their own performance.
Thank you so much. I think a lot of strong messages. It's very reassuring to know that we have a capacity like you on a world level governing this with a deep understanding of the need to actually have data interoperability, but also to have standards for systems that are used for actually storing or disseminating this data. I think this will be extremely important. And not least the big point that if the basic is not in place, if we don't have the data, and if we don't make sure that the ones who are providing the data get something back, that there is mutual benefits from actually doing so. So you could say low-hanging fruit to real people working in healthcare, then it will not be a success anyway. I think I must say, I also noticed one of you said connectivity as a human right. I would say we might also talk about a human right for actually having the best possible treatment. I mean, who would not like our loved ones to have the best treatment possible by, for example, providing safe data to finding cures. So thank you so much. Let me turn to Bernd again, and let's make a little bit an open discussion here in the last 20 minutes that we have. Bernd, you have now you have listened to all the speakers. I think there are a few things that keeps on coming back: data interoperability, mutual recognition that it has to be in a trusted environment, but shared at a world level, because pandemics and data and digital doesn't know really any borders. But what is it that a private sector health provider like Siemens Healthineers, I mean, what kind of products can you develop? How do you see the role of private sector in tapping into this ecosystem of trusted health data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I indicated a little bit in the opening, I mean, there's multiple levels of where health data and data-driven medicine can be introduced and supported. It starts with easier to use technologies, where basically also inequalities of sometimes of education can be supported because machines can do very basic jobs in a way by themselves, so that at least a certain standard of care can already be delivered. And then, I mean, the topic of helping clinical decision making in a more standardized, in a certain health context way is also where algorithms and artificial intelligence can support. And finally, and that is probably a bit an outlook, but in the next few years, this data-driven precision medicine, that means, can we do simulations of outcomes of certain treatments based on all data and biomarkers we have around a disease, a patient in the context and the respective organ where we have to do, where something is to be taken care of. And this requires basically the access to data in collaboration, well governed and with and highly responsible also to the private sector, to innovative startups, but also to industry that ultimately needs to develop products that are then released as medical products and put into patients' hands and into physicians' hands, first and foremost, to some extent also into patients' hands as it is appropriate. And there, one needs to always reflect, if you look at a specific question, sometimes big data gets really small, because you need in certain clinical pathways enough data to train algorithms. And there, very often even data of one individual country is not sufficient to train algorithms. You need pooling of data from multiple health systems. And this is why I'm very impressed of what Finland has done in FinData, but I encourage that this is taken broader. I fully subscribe to that every society has to adopt it for themselves, but why should people in Finland be so much more open, and they are, to use of data and their data in their benefit than people in other countries of the EU or elsewhere? So this is why this encouragement that there's a very strong use of this and broad databases are needed to answer these many, many questions that are applicable in the clinical space. This is something what private sector would encourage and advocate for.
Thank you so much. And I mean, it is amazing that we do have actually examples of trusted dissemination, trusted, collected, and of course it's down to, do we also have the same standard in EID? But can we actually scale these solutions? I mean, can we use Finland and if there are a few other nations that are in the same situation, can we use them as pilots for inspiration on how to do this in a global scale? I think that was a very clear idea on one way forward to basically move towards a situation where we have much more data available, but also where we can have much more trust and common standards. So let me turn to Joanna. Joanna, everybody is looking at Finland now, saying, let's do like Finland. I mean, when you see some of the basic components, you mentioned trust. What do you think is the trust driver that is kind of the biggest trust driver in Finland? Why is it in Finland that this was invented and not somewhere else?
Well, that is a very good question. It's not only medical, it's not only political, it has historical roots. Finns tend to trust authorities, and they also, as mentioned by other speakers, Finnish people trust that they benefit. So if they give their personal data away, they trust that it will come back as better medicines, better healthcare, and better healthcare services. And that's also happening. So you see the feedback very concretely here in Finland. Why do people in other societies, why don't they trust in their authorities? I'm not the best person to answer on that, but also the level of data security and safety is relevantly high here in Finland. So that's of course a very big thing as well.
Thank you so much. I think you said something very important here. You said they believe that they get something back. They believe that they benefit from this, right? So they feel that there is a give and a take, that they get better health services, that they get something back. I think it's what Dr. Swaminathan also said. There must be a mutual benefit in delivering data and see that you get something back. Now, turning to you, Dr. Nikendason, you mentioned maybe to have a framework for how to agree on data sharing on a more global level. I mean, what could that look like? I mean, is it something that should be done in the World Health Organization? Is it already something that we are talking about, that nations should say, in certain situations of pandemics, we are willing, we should, and we are ready to share data? Is that something that is being worked at?
I think this is something from a perspective that was looked at before the pandemic, and we're using our national networks of public health institutes as a driver of that. When, as you recall, you need the CDCs of the world, the China CDCs, the European CDCs, US, the kind of structures like that, and to be able to be the custodian of that data. And that they also work hard to create data literacy, because we have to make sure that we do not aggregate the issue, because we are at very different levels. I mean, folks in Finland, Germany, and other places are extremely different level, where you can collect that data, pull it, put it into a system, then use artificial intelligence or big data to analyze this data and make decisions. We are far from that. We are still at a level where you have to make sure that there's literacy of this data, what it is, and then shared ownership, but shared responsibility, which means that if I don't only need to share my data because it benefits me, but that it can benefit the community, or for whatever reasons we are collecting the data. So there's a common understanding that, as I said, that dialogue, that framework dialogue has started prior to the pandemic, and we hope that as this pandemic will help accelerate that discussion, that dialogue, so that is open and transparent discussion. The trust factor is about transparency, and transparency doesn't mean someone is attempting to hide something. It's just maybe lack of communication of what is it that we are doing with the public, with end users and the patients, and of course the authorities. That if people don't have clarity of that, say for example, you come in and you say, well, we have a cloud sourcing, we put the data into cloud, and then we can access it. The first thing you are discussing with the person at the ministry is that what is it, what are you talking about that is cloud, and how does it work? How do I make sure that if I throw my data, patient data into the cloud, then somebody else, how is it secured and whatever. So we tend to assume that because we are very familiar with those concepts, and we are probably using it in resource-rich countries, that those in the developing world automatically understand what it is all about. Don't assume. If you assume those things without investing in it, efforts to address it, then you create further distrust. You erode your trust capital. I think I must say also that we have to be very careful that the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially issues of access to vaccines, have eroded the trust capital significantly. We have to admit that, so that people in the global south view folks, a few richer nations, like, okay, why are we in this together? If one's threatened, you kind of take care of your own needs, and then we are left alone there. So we need to really be careful what we are doing with the vaccine access thing, so that we not erode the trust capital. That would be very, very important if we need to collect data from everywhere and warehouse it, use it, and share it in a timely fashion. Yeah. This is not hypothetical. If you recall, and Sonia will remember this, in the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, obtaining data was very difficult. I mean, sequences from some countries was extremely difficult. We have to always remember that was a sad moment in the public health or global health history. And you ask yourself the question, why is that? And it boils down to the trust capital that exists. And I don't think anyone will be hiding our heads in the sand if we said that the inequality and inaccessibility to vaccines have created more trust, rather it has eroded trust, and that will impact the way and manner in which people are willing to share things going forward, except we fix that very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge is always obliging to act, right? So if you have the data and the understanding that there are missing vaccines and diseases on a global level, and you ask for data from everybody, of course, the solution also have to be a common solution. not only a national solution. This is also what I hear you say. So we can only have a global pandemic response or even data collection if we also have a common response and program to address those challenges when we actually know. So thank you so much. So let me turn to Professor Dr. Krömer. You being also in Germany, we all know that Germany is a very strong European country. We normally say that, you know, they run the economy for many of the smaller countries. So for many, in many aspects, a very important country for Europe, but also beyond. We have a very different culture in Germany. I mean, I'm from Denmark. I have all my health data in one place. I order my COVID test. I can see my vaccines. Everything is transparent and collected. And yet I hear my colleagues, for example, in Germany, telling me that if you need to get your health record, you need to go to your doctor, and then you need to go to one other doctor, and you gather them in paper often. So how come these big differences, and how do we even within, you know, Europe, which is a much more uniform, how can you say, continent of stakeholders, how come there is so big differences, and how can we overcome that? And do you see also countries like Germany moving fast ahead on this agenda?
It's a complicated issue because, as I said already, the digitalization in medicine, in contrast to part of the industry, is really not advanced in our country. It's just the contrast. And it has to do with this interesting talk which we had in the frame of this discussion about trust, tradition, and all these kind of things. And at the end of the day, you have a kind of melange which ends up in a not very advanced information technical healthcare system. But now the pressure to do that has, in part due to COVID, risen to a point that I'm convinced that the next government, which is currently formed, will address that. And again, there will be a crucial point in developing something in which the population trusts. And I can imagine in that area only a public, not a private solution concerning the holding of these data. So I'm convinced there will be a large step forward. And I would just like to make one point, because I was very impressed by the issue of the inequality. Because now, if we have this rapid development in many countries, and I think the entire digitalization area moves so fast forward, in part due to private efforts, that it's difficult to control, that in turn, the amount of inequality, which is the payback of that, can increase even further. And I think it would really be a worthwhile a discussion how we can cope with that, how we can kind of handle that and kind of guide that into a direction which is at the end of the day leads to a reduction in inequality. I mean, you just mentioned a large inequality in Europe, currently to the large disadvantage of Germany's patients, right? So even in countries which have a comparable economy situation, you have these large differences, not talking about different countries with large economic differences. So I think that will be a major issue of the next years to get in a kind of control. And I'm convinced that WHO must play a major role in the entire thing. I don't see anybody else who could take that role.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Let me turn to Dr. Swaminathan. So, I mean, we heard about human rights and connectivity, etc. We also heard about unethical use of technologies and data. And of course, this goes without saying that this cannot take place within the health era. But is it somehow also unethical that we do not allow the same equal treatment for everybody who has the same situation? And is it also somehow unethical that we do not you know, provide the same treatment for the same diseases? And how long is there actually to go in that? I mean, you know, data and knowledge makes us very clever. And when you have knowledge, you also need to use that knowledge. If you have influence, we need to use that influence for the better. So how far do we have to go? I mean, will we have like a global convention or understanding in the long run that we need to treat people equally all over the world?
Thank you. I mean, I think that is really the fundamental question. And this is what WHO has been saying, is that our goal is universal health coverage, which means that everybody, regardless of where they live, need to get quality assured, effective, safe health services as close to their homes as possible without incurring a huge financial loss. And universal health coverage means access to diagnostics, access to treatments, but also preventive services, promotive services, rehabilitation, palliation. I mean, you know, half the world today doesn't have access to even basic essential health services, let alone all of these other things that we're talking about. So there is a long way to go. And I think to get to this point of universal health coverage by 2030, which is the goal that the world has agreed to, we need to start thinking about what is a public good, you know. And when we think about the way vaccines were developed, no doubt the private sector played a huge role. We wouldn't have the vaccines today if it hadn't been for the private sector, but the private sector was supported by public funds, by taxpayer money, by governments, huge investments made both in early research as well as in actually helping the companies do the trials, scale up the facilities. So a lot of public funds were put into this, and therefore one would expect that the products are made available for the public. We have examples of treatments for genetic diseases, which cost $1 million a shot. It is out of the reach of most people in most parts of the world. Very, very few people can afford it. So I think this inequities are not only between rich and poor countries, it's within countries. In every country, there are populations that are left out, that cannot access healthcare, however high income the country may be. So I think policymakers really need to put equity front and center, and all their policies that they develop, and you know, the governance frameworks. And I think health has to be governed by the public sector, by government. The private sector plays a role, they have to be brought in, but there has to be a framework, there has to be ethical principles, guidelines, regulations of what they do and how they contribute. And of course, they will also benefit. I mean, we've seen in the past that companies which have entered into partnerships with the generic manufacturers, for example, has been a win-win for the innovator company, because they've reached much wider number of people, the profits go up, but at the same time, they're doing good because the drugs or vaccines are being made available in an affordable way to many more millions of people. So this has happened with hepatitis C, it's happened with HIV, but it's taken too long. And I think we shouldn't be going back and seeing the same mistakes being repeated over and over again. Insulin was discovered 100 years ago. There was no patent to insulin because Banting and Best said that this has to be a public health good. It's a global public good. So they did not take a patent. And yet today, millions of people around the world have no access to insulin because it's controlled. The patents are controlled by a few companies. So there are many examples. And I think this is a time, the COVID pandemic, I think, to reflect and see, okay, what are the priorities? And if health is the most important for everybody's economic well-being, then I think we have to operate differently in the future.
Thank you so much. So we are running on the last minute, and before I turn to our host, Bernd, to basically close the session off, maybe just a few observations, might even call it conclusions. First of all, I hear there is more to be done on international level to really look at conventions of obligatory data sharing in certain situations, but also on a commitment to a give and take, that if patients are giving their data, they actually get something back and feel that they have contributed. I hear that there are a big need of data, common data, health data standards, also standards for systems used. Clarity is, of course, also for private sector, extremely important here. And then we have been inspired by Finland on how a trusted both collector and disseminator can actually boost this trust environment for private sector, for researchers, and not least for the benefit of the patient themselves. I want to thank you. I must say I'm super inspired by so knowledgeable speakers. And with that, thank you so much. I'll hand back to you, Bernd, to basically close the session off.
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia, also for guiding us through. A great thank you for very inspiring impulses from all panelists. I mean, I think we can reflect upon that, yes, as we are passing, or hopefully at the tail of a COVID-19 pandemic, that this has made us all aware how important collaboration is, how important innovation is by all stakeholders, governments, care providers, regulators, academia, as well as now private sector, who is, as we all feel, invited to the table for discussions. I think we have learned that European health systems, a bit of, we are in a World Health Summit, but European health systems have understood the need of supporting and of collecting data and making it available for innovations. I would want to be confident that the example of Finland and other countries will make it to other European countries, including the one we are at and my own, fairly soon, on the occasion of the clear need that was indicated or clearly demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic for existing other diseases and future resilience. We were also reminded how much we yet have to take care of inequalities, and that we never shall forget that very basics are still needed in many countries in order to have access to healthcare. And as the future of healthcare will be definitely more digital, definitely more networked, and definitely will need more equality of access. I think we have great impulses today. While we have been discussing this now, I think multiple World Health Summits, I think I have the impression I think we all have the impression that we now know what it takes, and we have first concrete example where it works. And that makes me confident that we'll be all together on a great journey. So thank you very much for the attention. Thank you very much for the participation, and wish you great World Health Summit in the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.